Many thanks, especially to Heike and the organizers of this conference to invite me to give this keynote speech, which I'm very glad to do, and I would like to talk to you in the next 25 minutes, and I try to be strict, on the concept of currency hierarchy and its implications for policy space for developing economies. And I labeled this as a framework because I would like to draw the broader picture which allows for serious work to be done in this. Okay, here's the point. So, in this conference, I can very easily and straightforward start from a Keynesian perspective. We have within Keynesian literature, we have the idea that, and this is, I think, something the room here agrees majoritarily, that monetary stability is not sufficient to achieve the multiple goals of growth and employment, other issues, but that the state has to have an active role in coordinating a series of policies to achieve these multiple goals. But when we assess this literature, we can see that it usually departs from rather general assumptions or applies it mostly to center or advanced economies. And the question I would deal tonight here is how we can apply this to developing and emerging market countries, which is a specific group of economies. And the arguments I will bring forward here is that the international asymmetry in monetary and financial affairs, which I call the monetary currency hierarchy, imposes major constraints to the policy space in these countries. But at the same time, this is not a purely deterministic approach. The policy space of these countries at the same time is determined by domestic policy variables. And much of what I present today, I owe to my co-authors, especially Daniela Prates and Luis Fernando de Paula. One of the papers we did has been recently published in the Journal for Post-Economics Studies. Okay, so I will talk first on the broader literature, then on the concept of currency hierarchy, then on the limits deducted from this concept of policy space for the countries at the bottom of the currency hierarchy, then on the challenges how to climb this hierarchy, and conclude. The broader literature, of course, we have the elaborations of Keynes on international currency relations and on currency markets, where he elaborates on the hierarchical nature of these relations between the key currency and other currencies. And his Keynes plan is an idea to reduce these international asymmetries. And you all are quite familiar with this literature, but he does not focus on emerging markets and developing economies in this period. We have another strand of literature, which are structuralist development economists from the very first generation of the post-war period. In Latin America, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean within the UN, ECLAC, with its president Raúl Prebisch, brought forward the figure of a center-periphery structural relationship at the global level, structured by the division of labor between commodity and manufactured good exporters, which he elaborates as a sticky and structural relation which is featured and reinforced by the global market. Another president later coming in term, José Antonio Campo, uses the same figure of a center-periphery relationship, but translates it from the world of trade to the world of finance, arguing that from the post-World War period of Bretton Woods to the post-Bretton Woods period, we have a change of relevance from trade to finance. And he assumes that we have the same kind of asymmetric relations between center and peripheral countries reflected in financial asymmetries. Then we have a series of publications of works in the field of international political economy, Jerry Cohen being the most relevant scholar here, bringing forward his concept of the geography of money, where he states that there's a non-fit between the geographical space within the boundaries of a country and the use of a currency. That there are countries which currency is larger than the geographical boundaries, while others, in other cases, the currency space is much smaller than the geographical boundaries. And he calls this, the result of this, a monetary pyramid, does historical and political economy analysis, including power issues, and elaborates on the privilege of the hegemonic or key currency. Then we have within standard economics the most well-known approach of Eichengreen and others, which is the idea of original sin, the concept of original sin, which is a purely empirical approach where they measure the ability to borrow abroad in one's own currency for every country, and discovered that more than 90% of all international financial contracts are not denominated in 150, but in 5 currencies. And correlating and trying to figure out why this is the case, they figure out that there's no correlation, no significant correlation with policy variables such as the behavior of debtors or fiscal behavior or inflation story or whatever, but it's a size issue. The bigger a country is and the bigger the network effect of a currency is, the more it is used. And that's why they call it original sin issue. Okay, so coming from this broader literature, how do we come to the concept of currency hierarchy? First, we again start with Keynes, where he, in the chapter 17 of the General Theory, establishes the total return of a specific asset, which can be money but also other assets, defined by the sum of 4 specific attributes, which is 1, the expected appreciation of this asset, the other one is the expected quasi-rent, the third one is the transaction cost or carrying cost of this asset, and the fourth one is the very Keynesian concept of the liquidity premium, which is the non-pecuniary return of holding money or an asset to tackle all issues of uncertainty. Okay, and the sum of this results in this total return. When we introduce this to the field of currencies, we have to specify a bit these attributes. First, A turns into the expected exchange rate, which in this world is determined not by fundamentals, but by short-term gains, which determine the expectation on longer-term on the longer-term exchange rate. Q turns the interest rate of the different currencies. C, which is the transaction cost to move between one currency and the other currency, we can translate into the degree of financial openness. And the last is the liquidity premium, which we interpret, and I will come back to that point, both as a structural variable, but which at the same time can be influenced by policy variables over the long term. To construct this concept of currency hierarchy, we draw on at least three different strands of literature. First, we have structuralist economists, basically from Latin America, which use this concept of currency hierarchy, of monetary asymmetries, based on the experience of repeated financial crises and monetary instabilities in Latin America. Second, we have so-called monetary Keynesians, there's some of them here present in this room, which elaborate on this asymmetric monetary nature based on the on an idea of monetary production. And third, we have more recent post-Keynesian authors, including Minsky, which many of you know, which goes directly straightforward to this concept of currency hierarchy with certain differences, of course. Okay. What has to be fulfilled to achieve an equilibrium at the foreign exchange market when we have two currencies? And here we label one currency a northern currency, which can be one hegemonic currency, as we have it in some periods of the recent global history, or a group of key currencies, which we label northern. And at the bottom we have currencies which are issued by developing emerging market countries, which we label as southern currencies. And the sum of the four attributes to achieve an equilibrium at the foreign exchange market has to be the same. As we assume that the liquidity premium of a southern currency is lower, remarkably lower than the liquidity premium of a northern currency, this difference in the liquidity premium has to be compensated by the sum of the three other attributes. And the three are relevant, but the special relevance comes to the interest rate differential. We can depict this graphically in a hierarchy where we have a decreasing liquidity premium from the top to the bottom. And we have here the hegemonic or the group of key currencies, and at the bottom we have maybe the emerging market currencies and developing economy currencies. And in the middle, a range of intermediate currencies, which I will not focus here. I argue that the currency hierarchy is a structural feature of the capitalist modern world, but it has variances over time, which I try to roughly depict with the concept of global monetary regimes, which I define by two dimensions. One dimension of a global monetary regime is the degree of regulation of capital flows, which can be ranged from totally unregulated to regulated. And the other dimension is the regulation or coordination of exchange rates from a fixed regime to a totally flexible regime. Synthetically, we have two rather stable arrangements where one dimension is unregulated, the other regulated, which are these two, and we have one extremely stable where both dimensions are regulated and one is, and at the other side, the two both are unregulated. And we can rather easily structure the last 100 years in that, where we come to the result that the post-Bretton Woods world is an extremely unstable compared to especially the Bretton Woods period, but also to a certain manner compared to the gold standard. That's what Yati Ghosh yesterday explained as a strong increase in financial and other instabilities and volatility. Okay. The implications for the currency hierarchy. It changes. The degree of steepness of the currency hierarchy differs over these regimes. We have a much more flatter pyramid here with a smaller difference in terms of the liquidity premium than in this context, where the differential of the liquidity premium increases strongly compared to this regime. So it's a more difficult world for the currencies at the bottom than this world. Okay, to illustrate the implications of the currency hierarchy, of this concept of currency hierarchy, I used the method of balance sheets as the approach of the stock flow consistency models do, but I use it as a method, not as a theory. We have the typical agents here, which is the net wealth owner, it's the banking sector with the central bank behind, it's firms and households. How do they interact in a closed economy? First, very easy. Wealth owners can decide to deposit part of their wealth as money in the banking system. The banking system can decide to provide credit to firms, and this will define the volume of the amount of wages created in this economy. Fine. And of course, this is not all. The amount of credit created here ex nihilo or endogenously depends on the interaction with the central bank, both with the instrument of the discount window and the function as a lender of last resort to prevent instabilities and the lack of liquidity in the banking sector as long as this is solvent. Okay, now we go to the open economy and go straight forward to the case of a southern currency with a lower liquidity premium than the northern currency. We have still the same interaction at the domestic level, but this competes with financial, credit relations and deposits in the northern currency, which I denominate here as the US dollar conveniently. We have the fact that external banks, international banks, can provide credit both to the banking sector and to firms in this northern currency to a lower interest rate. So there's an incentive for these actors to engage in financial contracts in US dollar because the costs are cheaper. But the problem is that now the central bank cannot guarantee anymore the full stability of this banking sector because it can only fulfill its lender of last resort function by emission of its own currency for this kind of relations in domestic currency, but not for credit and debits in foreign currency. Here it only can draw on its foreign exchange, foreign reserves, which are a limited fund. So there is a structural fragility built in southern currency due to a limited lender of last resort function of the central bank. Okay, now we go from the still rather convenient world of Bretton Woods to the world of post-Bretton Woods. These increases the fragilities of these economies because first, the domestic wealth owners can choose between depositing wealth as money in the domestic currency or in an international currency. So this, ceteris paribus, as the liquidity premium is lower, will decrease the level of deposits here. And second, we have new other investors. And of course, this is a very simplified picture of global financial interaction in the world of today. But let's say we have here an international investor which additional to banks, to international banks, can provide credit to banks of southern economies, to firms, and what we have in the recent years can even provide credit not only in US dollar but also in domestic currency, for example, investing in public bonds, something we have seen massively in the last years, which translates the risks of exposure towards the volatile decisions and the decisions driven by the difference in the liquidity premium from only foreign currency denominated financial relations to domestic financial instruments, just as public bonds in domestic currency, increasing furthermore the instability of these economies. Okay, the implications of this for the policy space at the bottom or at the lower level of the currency hierarchy. First, what kind of monetary policy can these countries do? You remember the difference in the liquidity premium has to be compensated. And an important instrument to compensate this difference of the liquidity premium is the interest rate. So the interest rate has to be structurally higher in these economies, so there's no covered interest rate parity. This translates in a lower level of credit and investment, and thus lower growth, which by this way can explain a no convergence of this group of countries at the global level, and can explain maybe a share of global inequalities. And at the same time, it produces and reproduces a lower level of financial development, because the domestic financial sector will be smaller than in other currencies, and will be more short-term, because the uncertainties in these currencies are higher regarding the interest rate and the exchange rate. And why? The monetary policy, the transmission channel for monetary policy gets smaller. So the central bank, when it wants to regulate domestic demand or curb domestic demand, has to do a sharper reaction in terms of interest rate adjustment. For the exchange rate policy, the exposure to boom-bust cycles is highly relevant. All of you are familiar with the phenomenon of boom-bust cycles, and these get more depicted, more extreme in this group of countries. As the boom in these currencies, in terms of capital inflows, is driven basically by an interest rate differential between the northern and southern currencies, in a moment of low levels of interest rate of the key currencies or the hegemon currency, these other southern currencies become the object of investment or desire, as we call it, of global investors, which ceteris paribus produces higher demand for these currencies, which produces an upward pressure on the exchange rate, which builds up risks both at the balance of payments, at the capital account, and at the domestic sector, because as these are short-term aims of gains directed towards the interest rate differential, this will not be an appreciation sustainable over the long term. And in the bust, we have the contrary, that when the interest rate differential shrinks because advanced economies or northern economies do raise their interest rate, then the difference in the liquidity premia will gain higher relevance. So these will be the first currencies to be sold. So we have a flight of currency to quality with exacerbated cycles of capital flows towards and from emerging markets. This produces high pressure on emerging markets and developing economies. And here, of course, we are talking mainly about emerging markets which opened their capital account towards these kind of capital inflows to raise the interest rate in order to prevent a too strong depreciation of their currency. There's all this fear of floating literature about it. And eventually also to deepen its financial openness to attract further capital flows and to stem against the wind of a bust cycle. When this is not successful, these countries will suffer financial crisis, which at the same time always are currency crisis. When you look at the databases of Lem Valencia and others, you will see that in developing emerging market countries, financial crisis or banking sector crisis almost always are at the same time currency crisis, and their amount often is much bigger in terms of loss of GDP. Okay. As a result, we have, as renamed studies have shown a long time ago, a higher volatility of the exchange rate of these currencies at the southern end of the currency hierarchy. So the impossible duality, which has been shown by authors in general when economies maintain an open capital account and are not the hegemonic currency, are even more sharper for this group of countries. Okay. So we have a reduced policy space as a result for this group at the bottom. Okay, how to climb the ladder if countries want to do that. The major relevance for these countries to, at the longer term, increase the liquidity premium of the currencies would be to reduce the volatility of the exchange rate. In order to reduce the pressure on the interest rate, on monetary policy, and on the necessity to open the capital account to maintain financial stability. So, capital account regulation is highly relevant for these. Financial development is another issue in terms of institutional building, provision of public credit, etc. The central bank here will not be able to pursue a policy of inflation targeting because it has a double target of stabilizing not only the price level but also the exchange rate. And policy coordination of giving priority to the stabilization of the exchange rate will require a balanced fiscal policy over the cycle, rather moderate wage policy, where we come to the conclusion that this leaves a rather limited space for redistributive policies at the domestic level. Okay, I come to the conclusion. So, what I argue here is that this currency hierarchy is a structural feature which can explain global inequality due to the differences in terms of growth, in terms which are reproduced by higher volatility at the bottom of the currency hierarchy. These economies have available different degrees of policy space, which has to be taken into account in all kind of modeling when you analyze these countries. And that the relative change of the position within this hierarchy is by far a short-term, easy set package of policies, but is a rather long-term and difficult endeavor. Because this priority for a stable and competitive exchange rate is very challenging for the policy coordination of different policies, and also puts rather sharp limits to redistributive policies. But we also argue, and I don't have the time here, that this depends very much on the specific situation of currencies. So you don't have a homogeneous group of developing and emerging market countries, but it depends very much on which global regime you are in, what are the specific vulnerabilities of the country in terms of level of external debt, what is the moment of the global liquidity cycle, what are the institutions in, what is the priority of policies within these countries, etc., etc. And institutions, of course, here matter. And the last point I want to make is, and this is very important to highlight, that there is no universal strategy for all countries to climb this ladder, because it's a structural feature. And you can very easily see this by the requirement of capital account surpluses, which can only be achieved by one part of countries, not by all, because we have a closed society, world economy. So it would be, if any, a very selective approach of successful policies. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.